A very good afternoon. Once again, Ben Jacobs with you as we approach the finishing line of the inaugural Sport Integrity Week put on by SIGA and powered by MasterCard. I should reiterate my thanks to the whole team behind the scenes, the production staff, to Elder as well, who I meant to shout out in the last panel, who has not only been operating some of the questions and appearing on panels, but was a firm supporter and has been working very closely with Kosovo's National Olympic Committee. So she's wearing a number of different hats this week. So thank you, Elder, and of course to the likes of Emmanuel and Katie and Ian and everyone else on the team as well. Do get in contact. SIW is the hashtag. We'd love to know your thoughts. Send us a photo of where you're watching from, and of course questions via the app as well. We have a panel coming up in just a moment on smuggling and human trafficking, and then we start to wrap things up with two final sessions: sport integrity as a catalyst for social development, followed by raising the bar in support of youth coaches. And then that will be that, unless of course you want to twist our arm for another 2 days to make it a 7-day working week rather than 5, but perhaps we'll gun for that next year instead. Two final bits of housekeeping to tell you about. One is via social media. You can see clips from a number of the panels, but in addition, a press release has just gone live on our new gold standards for race, gender, diversity and inclusion in sport. So please do check that one out. And we've also released our 15 youth leaders who will form a brand new and really exciting SIGA Youth Council. So many congratulations to those on our SIGA Youth Council. They are Alex Christmas from the UK, Alexandra Sokolova from Germany, Andrea Milvanovic from Serbia, Anton Kliszewski from Germany, Kanel Daniel from Sejon, Ethan Kurakese, USA, James Flanagan, also from the UK, Kenta Iwasawa from France, Mauricio Hernandez Londono from Colombia, Max Patrick Fameju of France, Oliver Hines of the UK, Sukriti Barzwaj of Spain, Taylor Green, who's based in the USA, Thomas Macedo de Medeiros, that's Emmanuel's son, the CEO of SIGA, he's in Portugal, and Tosin Gabea of the UK as well. So we look forward to hearing more from all 15 of you. And I think the criterion to get on that SIGA Youth Council was to have a really difficult surname to pronounce. So I hope I've done each of you justice, but apologies if I haven't quite got the pronunciations right from all those names around the world. But congratulations to those who are on our new SIGA Youth Council. Right, let's move on to our next panel then. It is called Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Human Trafficking and Smuggling in Sport. And this is certainly not a new issue, but it's definitely an area where progress remains slow and relatively secret as well. So we're going to try and breach, if you like, the tip of the iceberg. And to do that, I'm delighted to welcome once again one of our regular voices and moderators throughout Sport Integrity Week, and that is Paul Nicholson. He is the editor-in-chief of Inside World Football. Paul, a very good afternoon. It is over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Ben. You are without doubt the premium sports broadcaster in integrity and generally in sports. Thank you very much. You've been fantastic this week, and you've certainly saved my backside a few times. Right, the panel, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Human Trafficking and Smuggling in Sport. Ben's absolutely right. This has been around for a while. The talking to various people around this and talking to our panelists, there is a feeling that generally this is a bit of an iceberg, and that most of it is below the surface. We're not seeing that. We do see individual cases of it. We every now and again hear a story, usually of a footballer who's got himself into a really awkward situation, a country a long way away from home. We see in football, we see FIFA banning clubs, very high-profile clubs, on the basis of breaches of their own child transfer rules, basically under 16 rules, and we will come back to this in a bit more depth with Innie a bit later, because there's some big issues and understandings around this. But what on the panel today, what I'm going to do is just introduce them briefly, and then go back to them and ask them to explain what they actually do, and also to ask them to give a very brief one-paragraph explanation of what they think child trafficking is, because as it was said in our chat beforehand, we need to avoid the banalities. To avoid the banalities, we need to have a really good definition of what we understand by child trafficking. So with me, first, we have Giovanni Di Cola, who's the special advisor to the Director General of the International Labour Organization. We have Ini Obeng Nkang, I hope I've got that, Obong Nkang, who is an English Nigerian or a Nigerian Englishman who is a lawyer, but currently at Nottingham Trent University, where he's sabbaticaling as an academic with a particular focus on child trafficking and particularly within football. We have Fred Lord, the Director of Anti-Corruption and Transparency and Operations at the ICSS. Fred's a former police officer. And we have Jax Harrison, who is the CEO and founder of the Innovation for Good Incorporated. And she's also very much a leading light within StopChildTrafficking.org and the SWAT League for Sports Teams Against Human Trafficking. So there's a lot. Jax, you win the prize for the longest intro. So if I could actually go to you first, Jax, if you could tell us a little bit more about the organisations, and I'm particularly interested in the Teams Against Human Trafficking initiative, and also what, from your perspective, and obviously you're looking at all of human trafficking and all of child trafficking, not just sports-related stuff. What would your definition of child trafficking be?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Paul. Nice to meet all my esteemed panel members, and to Siga for having me here. So, like you mentioned, I wear lots of hats. I am the CEO and founder of Innovation for Good, where we look at the problems surrounding vulnerable populations, particularly with the lens of child and human trafficking, and we discover, develop and deploy technology for good to interrupt those chains of human trafficking. So that's our sort of main goal and focus, and our foundation for that is stopchildtraffic.org. I'm also the Director of International Relations for Sports Teams Against Trafficking, or SWAT League, which is out of the United States, where they are raising awareness of the issue of human trafficking around sporting events, and how we can encourage teams and celebrities and players to sign up to stand against that. So it's a little bit about what we do. When we talk about child and human trafficking, I mean, so many of us here probably know that of the 40 million people that are trafficked every year, 1 in 4 of them are a child. And what we want to look at as our lenses is every phase of that trafficking. So how do they become trafficked? What are the vulnerable moments in their lives that lead them to being trafficked? Is that abject poverty? Is it, which is often the case, financial inclusion of the parent? What's happening? There's 1.7 billion people who have no bank account, no access to financial inclusion, and are desperate to really earn funds and to build up a life for themselves and for their children. And I think that's often a trigger. We see 65 million people a year displaced due to terrorism or some kind of governmental issue that causes them to move away, and so they become vulnerable as well. And when we think of child trafficking, we often think of sex trafficking, but it's also labor, it's also forced criminality. And when we look at it from the point of view of the law, we often forget that coercion and forced criminality are actually trafficking as well. So we need to make sure that we're looking at all of that, including, smuggling, the smuggling of drugs, or whatever the child or minor may be forced to do, that the child is always a victim, not a criminal, and making sure that as we look at that and as they're processed, the judicial system, the governments and the people in play know to look at the children and minors involved through that lens. And I think that's like a huge part of education. But
thank you. Yeah, okay, so there's a lot there that we're going to come back on, not least of out of this 14 million, or 1 in 4, so that's 10 million kids. How many of them?
10 million children a year.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge number. And how many, so what's that number for sport? Obviously, we don't know that.
That's true. It's actually been hard to find the actual statistics on that. I was digging around before this conversation to sort of really find out how many in sports, and it is a sort of a bit of a murky pond.
Okay, so Giovanni, if I could come to you next. Obviously, you're the special advisor to the Office of the Director General at the International Labour Organization. If you could explain a little bit about your role there, and also how human trafficking, smuggling in sport affects the way that you view things.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for inviting me, and I'm happy to be part of this panel, although I must say it is not my primary topic in which I work. There is a team that works in the ILO on fundamental rights at work, so I also speak on behalf of that team with whom I work daily on those issues. But let me give you more a focus which is more policy oriented or political, if I may say. And I would like to start with the good news, because and then I come to what is less good news. The good news is that on the 4th of August 2020, so just a few weeks ago, the Director General of the ILO announced publicly and officially that the Convention 182, which is Convention on the Worst Form of Child Labor, adopted in 1998, actually was universally ratified. This means that 187 countries around the world, member states of the ILO, International Labour Organization, which, as you all know, it's the UN agency that deals with employment issue and decent work agenda since 1919, was able actually to push this challenge and this opportunity through. And what this means in terms of protection, because this is what actually has an impact also on child labor, of course, slavery, trafficking, kids who are trapped in armed conflict. They are actually subject to sexual exploitation, illicit activities, and so on. They do have, all children will benefit out of this convention from a legal protection against child labor, and therefore against human trafficking. It's important to note, and this is absolutely essential, because I think that sometimes we should do more in terms of raising awareness and informing each other what actually what we are doing. So this is a great opportunity to do so, is that we don't need, as individual, or for example, a SIGA, we may get the information out of the committee of experts of the ILO on the ratification and the implementation of the ratification of Convention 182 everywhere around the world. So if we want to have a source of information which is very reliable, accountable, that we can actually update it because it is reviewed every year, that is a source of information where we can tap on. And I think that's something, I'm not sure that it is always so disseminated, this kind of information. I'm glad that we have this opportunity. The second issue, which I think is so important, sport federations, clubs, when they organize some events, for example, and when they are caught into something that it is not necessarily best practice or the good ethics, they might say that, you know, they are not actually responsible for implementing legislation related, for example, to minimum age or actually they are. Because when a ratification of a convention like this is universally accepted, it means that everyone can actually refer to the jurisprudence related to the convention. If I talk difficult language and so on, please stop me. I will try to be, but I'm trying to make it easy. The second issue, and I stop there with as an introduction, which is extremely powerful, the Convention 182, which was adopted in 1998, actually is part of a political declaration of the ILO. And this declaration is a declaration on fundamental principles and rights at work. So child labor is a fundamental principle and right at work. So it's the equal of human rights. Freedom of association is equal to human rights. The convention against forced labor is the same. So, and guess what? you do not need to even ratify those conventions to actually apply them. So every single member state of the ILO, because of its membership to the ILO, International Labour Organization, is abide by those principles because they are human rights principles. So I give you an example, and then I will follow the discussion as you will indicate. I discussed with the IOC there on those issues. I said, okay, why in the bid book, of the games, you do not insert this clause directly? Because if you were doing so, the discussion would not be only on what is not working during the games, the infrastructures and so on and so forth, the labor issues that we have seen, even at the level of FIFA. If they do refer to those conventions beforehand, they protect themselves because then they can engage in a dialogue with the member states. Or they even can engage with the dialogue with the private businesses, as it was the case in Qatar 2022, where the ILO actually promoted those conventions. And it is working fairly well now. It was not working well at the beginning, but then through a number of discussions, and including discussion at the governing body of the ILO, we were able to actually implement programs towards this idea. Evidently, the labor code that was just approved in Qatar is free from those aspects, which was former child labor and smuggling and trafficking and so on and so forth. So this is possible. I saw one question where how do we make it possible? I can give you some examples. There was a question about the Caribbean. I was there as director for a number of years. I can give you concrete examples, but that is the good news. So we do have something we can hook up to, we can refer it to. It's inspiring even when we develop policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I didn't know that, and I should have known that. Effectively, what you're saying is that there is nowhere to hide, really, because if your country is signed up, or you're in a jurisdiction that's signed up to Convention 182, then you really have a responsibility to follow these things. So your jurisprudence would mean that you are liable. I think that's a fantastic rule. I think people need to know that. I mean, from my own personal experience, sitting on a board of a professional sport on the international level in rugby league, we were being courted by one of the Middle Eastern countries to take a major event of ours there, and we chose not to. But not because of Convention 182. 182 would have made it really easy for us to say, no, we can't do that. We chose not to for other reasons, and basically for the personal integrity of people on the board, which was reassuring. But actually to know that you can, now there was blowback from our membership from that, real blowback from our membership. We said, well, why are you turning this money away? And we said, well, because we just didn't feel comfortable with it as a board. However, we could say, well, we can't because Convention 182 says we cannot do this. That is fantastic. Right. I will come back to that because there's an enforcement issue around that.
Absolutely.
If I could now go to Fred Lord, Director of the ICSS, and the Anti-Corruption and Transparency Operations Director at the ICSS. Fred has been in and around this for a very, very long time. He is pretty much an expert on everything to do with criminals, and has chased lots of them around the world, undercover and probably less undercover. Fred, could you sort of give me an explanation of where the ICSS sits at this moment as regards human trafficking? I mean, obviously we've had a prior discussion, and you're saying that the smuggling area is something you're seeing more of at the moment. But if you could give me the overview on that, and then again, what is the ICSS? Where does the ICS what's their distinction when it comes to human trafficking?
Thanks very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here on this critical panel. Yeah, we at the ICSS, at the Sport Integrity Unit, so we've been focusing on this for a while, since 2017, and before we've established a hotline where we've had approximately 278 cases from 72 different countries, all interconnected crimes across sports. Getting a good grab of everything from match fixing, trafficking, drug trafficking, beneficial club ownership through to terrorism. And so since inception in 2017, we've had about 36 cases in relation to player trafficking, and that's from about 20 different countries. So from former operations that we've conducted in Paris, and we've spoken to some young ones that have been recruited from overseas. That was when we first looked at the situation between trafficking and smuggling. From our discussions with the young gentlemen from Cameroon, Ghana, they were quite open to the fact that yes, they've been brought over from Africa, and the circumstances have changed. They no longer have the funds to stay there. The clubs have pulled out support. They had on the issues in relation to the definition of trafficking. It's very similar to what's been mentioned before in relation to forced coercion and fraud, etc. But also from the smuggling side, we saw a lot of cases where they obviously voluntarily came across, but that doesn't also mean there's other issues of circumstances of aggravation that turn smuggling back into trafficking. So it's quite a dynamic topic, and what we've definitely seen some not just sort of standard type trafficking and smuggling activities. Quite interesting in the sporting environment. As James mentioned, there's still not a bucket load of information, intelligence, and findings on this issue through sport.
Okay, thanks, Fred. Could we? I'm not gonna say anything more on that. Could you just check your mic as well, Fred, because you were dropping out a bit for me. I'm not sure if that was the same for other people. Inni, if I could come to you. Obviously, the research you're doing at Nottingham Trent University and what you're finding out there is obviously sort of at the centre of what we're talking about here, particularly within football. Could you sort of give me an overview of what you are doing right now and how what you are discovering particularly within the football area?
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to Sika for having me and inviting me on. So as part of my overview, I will touch on some of the things that Jax and Giovanni have spoken about. But my research is essentially looking at the football trafficking problem to sort of compare it to what we know as generic levels of human trafficking, and then see that the similarities are clear for everybody. So, for instance, the path in which an African child or a South American child takes in Europe is very, very similar to what happens in the life of a football player in the same access or coming from the same access, and then the destination and the source countries are often the same sort of pathways. So my research essentially looks at from the legal perspective to say, what does the law say about this problem? Well, not generically speaking in terms of laws. I look at specifically the football laws, what the football laws have in order to prevent this problem from being the level that it currently is. And a part of my research compares this to other international laws and says, okay, at an international, like Giovanni spoke about, and other laws like the UNCRC, and things that the ILO have been very much involved with. So to then say, have those organizations and have those bodies have they had a better success rate in being able to curb child trafficking in general. And as Jax mentioned right at the start, yes, there's progress being made, but at the end of the day, there's still an enormous amount of people and children, 10 million, being trafficked every year. Now, at the start of the program, you had mentioned that, what is the number for footballers? Well, for sports, you asked, but I don't know for all sports, but for football in particular, the statistic is 15,000 minors, not just minors of all regions, specifically African minors are trafficked to Europe every year. This was uncovered by research done by a charity in France called Foot Solidaire. And they basically said, there's about 15,000 minors trafficked from Africa to, places like France, Belgium, et cetera, for the specific purpose of exploiting their sporting talent. So my research is saying the approach or the current approach to the problem seems to be very much divided. And as much as there's progress with Convention 182, like has been spoken about, the nature of sports governing bodies allows them to exist with limited accountability to these governmental and governmental national organizations. So, in simple terms, when there are grave issues like human rights, like human trafficking, child trafficking, the fact that FIFA or another sports governing bodies are not directly accountable to a national organization allows them or gives them a leeway to essentially point the finger at other people, at other organizations, or other bodies in terms of responsibility for this crime. There is a document by FIFA called Protection of Minors. In the document, FIFA admits that they are aware there's two different types of trafficking. There's human trafficking in football and there's human trafficking in football. In the document, FIFA explained that human trafficking in football is where a boy is taken and is signed onto an exploitative contract, and maybe a person of the boy's contract goes to an agent or somebody, an intermediary that is overseeing the child, and that the child needs to work. Is more like labor exploitation in the sense that the player can work for out of 24 hours a day and not be given 3 square meals. That kind of scenario in which these boys are allowed to exist in, for the sole purpose of money off them, and if they become successful and go to another professional team, then knock down benefits or economic benefits for these persons, sort of reassures them that, okay, there's money to be made and we'll go and make some more, which then goes on to Fred's point about various source countries. Ghana, you mentioned Ghana, how they falsify documents and purport to be relatives in European countries in order to find avenues to bypass national laws to get these people, to get these young footballers to European countries. So in FIFA identifying that there's human trafficking in football, so with this scenario, FIFA says, okay, our laws are supposed to ban trafficking of minors or the signing of underage players, which, as we know, is there, but the effectiveness or the efficacy of that law is very much questionable. And as Paul said right at the start, there's a number of hyper clubs that have been held culpable for those kind of deals that they're doing. So, but to put that to one side and then say, okay, with just that law, which is in their regulations on the status of players, FIFA's laws, they say that in itself is enough to prevent the trafficking of minors. And with 15,000 minors still continuously being trafficked every year, it's questionable about how effective that regulation is. But FIFA then say, human trafficking through football, which is more generic and which is essentially trafficking occurring with just the mere mention of football within the deal, makes it trafficking through football as opposed to in football. So I'll give you an example. A child could be trafficked for the purpose of going to, they said that he was going to play for Chelsea, ends up, in a country, etc. Those kind of scenarios, FIFA say, are not their responsibility. And with the lack of accountability, the organization is allowed to point at other bodies and say, this is more of a global problem. Human trafficking is a global problem. But my research, in summary, my research says that because it is a global problem does not mean that sports organizations in particular, which is my focus, should not do more to curb the problem, should not do more to improve the nature of its regulation on the problem, and that in line with the discussions of the week, should not have more integrity with the way they are dealing with the human trafficking problem. So having an in-depth look at the laws and basically suggesting that there should be more collaboration between FIFA and other international bodies and governmental bodies to, tailor their laws to the nature of the crime in order to have a much more improved impacts on limiting the problem from occurring.
So, I mean, let's drill into that 15,000 figure a lot again, and see what happens to these children. So that's just from Africa, 15,000 just from Africa. So you can reckon that it is probably from South America is going to be a similar number, if not perhaps a little bit higher. All of it. So that's 15,000 a year. So say it's 30,000 a year. They are all presumably going to professional teams or to clubs that have links with professional teams that can give them that bridge into the professional game. Because in the first instance, they're being trafficked for their talent, aren't they?
Yes, they're being trafficked for their talent, and the end goal is them to go into a professional team. But it's not often the case because, Fred said it in a bit of his explanation. There's players that go to these teams or go for trials. They're trafficked for purpose of trial, then they are unsuccessful in their trial, and then with the nature of the laws, a football team is not bound by international law in how they treat a player who has failed at trial. And for instance, the players that has an increased likelihood of merely being abandoned, having not been signed, then it's like, okay, there's not much we can do for you here. And that then, with the precarious nature of having been trafficked for that specific purpose, and then not making it as a successful player or being signed onto a contract with this professional team, that then transitions into a more general knowledge or more general understanding of what we know as human trafficking. In that, the player could end up as a sex case, or it could end up in slums, stealing, etc., in this foreign country because they were trafficked from Africa to, for instance, France. They don't make it as they don't get a professional contract, and then they're abandoned by the team, by the who traffic them, the intermediary or the unscrupulous individual looking to profit off them, because at the point in which they can no longer be signed, they lose the profit of the transaction, so they are abandoned.
Right, and that's when they end up. We don't really know where they end up, do we? That's when they become one of Jax's 10 million kids. So what we're really saying is there needs to be some responsibility here with the clubs. You can't, if you are taking a child on trial, and I think I'm going to ask you again, what's the definition of a child? Because we know that within FIFA laws changes a little bit to the rest of the world and civil society. But if the club takes a child from a foreign country on trial, even if it's only for a few days, they must have a responsibility for the welfare of that child, not just while that child is with them, but surely with them coming into the country to do that. I mean, Giovanni, does any of that fall under the ILO conventions?
Well, let's take. I fully agree with the approach that my fellow speaker was proposing. Let's have a look from another perspective for a minute. So, because he mentioned something which is the independence of sport, basically. So I researched this not long ago, actually very recently. I couldn't find any law or any regulations that stipulate that sport as a sector, including all the governance of sport, is independent. The only independence we're talking about in history is the independence from de Coubertin, who was saying that this IOC was supposed to be independent because that was the best way to ensure the values of the Olympism. But I've never come across something that including saying, sports sector is independent. What actually would manifest this independence would be the existence of jurisprudence or jurisdiction. So we are talking about the CAS in Lausanne, and then the CS, which has been established in fact to avoid the direct relationship between funding from IOC into the CAS. So out of this, there is no independence, number one. So I think we need to, open up our ears and eyes and minds and say, what is what today? The second issue is basically the society is challenging sport all over the place. The issue of racism, we are talking now about issues that are related to a specific situation, but Kaepernick was 4 years back. The issue of Carlos and John were decades back, and so on. So the issue of racism has been challenging the world of sport. The two articles in the Olympic Charter, 40 and 50, related to the athletes, are actually being questioned fundamentally, and they will be reviewed according to what's happening outside. So the issue of how you use the image of the athletes in the games and the issue of how athletes can speak out is being questioned throughout. Now, we are living in a period of COVID-19. So this probably, if we were in a normal situation, we were having this discussion somewhere in UK, somewhere in Geneva, or somewhere else together, and we cannot. Now, even COVID is actually challenging sport because basically the lack of prevention, the lack of protocols in place makes that the sport can no longer take place as it was. So my point here is the society is challenging sport to make sure that sport is no longer seen as independent. And then I come to your question about values, integrity, and then implementing standards. We don't need to create standards where they exist. I gave you the example of Convention 182. We just need to refer to what the mechanisms are there and make sure we can connect with those mechanisms. Now, SIGA is important, and there are other stakeholders, multi-stakeholders also working. And Emmanuel always has indicated that he wants to work with others, and I always push this statement because I think it's important. We don't need actually always to reinvent the wheel when we know how we can use those issues. So for smuggling and and in particular human trafficking, the numbers in a way are not going to help us out, because we can use the numbers by saying clubs have responsibilities, FIFA has responsibility. But one way to deal with it is that and this is happening, this is actually happening, when we found proof of human trafficking, what we have to do is to fight where it happens. And this is where you find all the difficulties. But I want to make sure that this is it's something that I'm talking about, something I am experiencing myself, because I am part of board. I represent the ILO in another multi-stakeholders initiative, and this takes care of those situations in private. Unfortunately, they cannot be public, but they are resolved. So they are resolved. Why? I can give you two names, two countries, because they have been published in The Guardian, and you can find articles all over the place. One was in Afghanistan, the other one in Haiti, where there are, issues of abuses, sexual harassment, and so on and so forth. The complexity of the case sometimes does not, not everything is outside. But the way it is fought, it was fought in Afghanistan, is being fighting now in Haiti, is quite positive, because the problem is protection of whistleblowers. The problem is legislation and lack of legislation in the countries we are talking about. The other problem is how do you protect those who have been abused? And then how do you enforce the law, which actually was your question before, how we enforce. So one issue that, a response is an example, how do we make sure that those legislation, those international standards can apply? And this can influence FIFA, this can influence a national football federation in a given country, because we do a gap analysis. We see what legislation is there. We know that this legislation gap has deficits, so we can fill those deficits. This is with best practices, with the knowledge that it is available at the level of the UN at different level, which can be shared with each and every one of you when it comes to an alliance like SIGA. And then we can do something good into it, because then we can either put into the positive position the different clubs, because sometimes the clubs are either, I'm not saying they are victims, but you know, they may not be advised to the best possible way. So that's one way to deal with it. So it's articulated, it's not easy to do, but the knowledge is there, the mechanisms are there. And now with those multi-stakeholders initiative, we actually have the opportunity to act. The last point is about this issue of integrity. I noted throughout the week that sometimes is overused somehow. But for me, and this is how UN looks at integrity. You know, one of the competency of an official of the UN is integrity, which means that basically we don't break the rules. In sport, many times, many actors in the past have been breaking the rules. In other terms, cutting corners here, or and the issue of not knowing the law, not knowing the rules, is not an excuse not to apply the rules. So the basic point, the basic standard, the basic understanding of integrity is the fact that there are values, there are rules, regulations attached to those values, there are policies, there are responsibility and accountability frameworks. It is not because people, institutions, new institutions are not aware of those that they should not abide by them and then being taken responsible for them. So I think that this is something where, you know, step by step, and the advantage of this debate over a week actually brings us to some concrete form of not only collaboration, but also collective action towards achieving those. So reducing the number of children, the footballers from Africa that are actually smuggled, forgotten somewhere in Europe or elsewhere. Also putting pressure on the clubs who actually have their responsibility when they develop their cantera, their academy, and the way they develop the academy, because this is a matter of national law. It's not a matter of the countries that they depart from. It's the countries where they are there, and I think this is where we can make a difference.
Okay. Yeah, a lot there, Giovanni. Thank you. A few points to pick up on. You mentioned the Haiti and the Afghanistan. Yeah. The horror, and they are horror, of those cases is that they were going on for a long time. They have been written about for a long time. I wrote the story on one of them 3 years ago, and they were happening at the very, very top of the federations, the very top, the president. And that's where the culture was not changing. And that's worrying. So it took some very, very brave individuals to come out and say, this can't go on. And they didn't go on, and they've been affected by it. They didn't say, I'm not stopping it at this. It's not me coming out and saying, I didn't like this. You've got to stop for the people that are following me. And the problem is within sport, the threat of what they can do to the person's career and everything else is very difficult to overcome. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing it right now. And Emmanuel doesn't like me to name names, but I'm going to name the name. Ahmed, head of the CAF, one of the 6 most senior men in football, has multiple allegations of sexual harassment against him. Multiple. There are affidavits filed at FIFA to the ethics committee. Nothing has been done. He continues in his position. He continues with his entourage around him. And from what I hear, his behavior has hardly changed at all. So how do we stop that kind of stuff going forward? If it means naming and shaming, we have to name and shame, because this is the modern world. I want to sort of go back a bit, and Jax, I want to ask you two things. Fred, I want to ask you about whistleblowing lines. And how effective they are in this case. And Jax, I want to ask you about on the broader scale and within the team's work that you do and trying to get people to sign up to the code. What is the kind of sign up you're getting on that? I mean, are people receptive to that? So if I could go to you first, Jax, and then Fred come back on the whistleblowing and stuff like that.
Hi, thanks. With the Sports SWAT League, we're finding quite a few individual celebrities and people signing up as opposed to teams. And so that's sort of my role, is to start getting teams involved. And we do have a few. We'd like to see more. We've got quite a list of people associated with organizations. It looks like we will next year have some of the associations sign up with us in the States, like the NBA, for example, or maybe the Footballers League. And so we're working towards getting that across the country, and that'll sort of really increase that reach, the knowledge, the awareness, and the discussion around human trafficking, and particularly in those areas, not just outside of the sports arena where we see the sex trafficking, but also within the culture and exploitation. So that's what we're hoping to see in the next probably year. So we've got some big announcements coming out in January, I believe, for that. So, but
Okay.
you know, people aren't, I think, to the point wanting to acknowledge what's happening in sports and what has happened. I think that's why this is important, and why it's important to have these stakeholder meetings, to be involved and to be really talking about it. I think all of our panelists have mentioned some really great things, and I wish we had like another hour. But to that point, Giovanni's point, and Annie's and Fred's, it's collaboration, it's enforcement, and it's awareness of that responsibility, which is what we're trying to promote. You know, you are responsible, and there are laws around that, and you know, we need to collaborate. We can't do this alone.
Yeah, Fred. I mean, collaboration is a big thing. Obviously, you've been out on your own line, Fred, with a long time with the ICSS, banging a drum for whistleblowers and collecting information. And the smuggling side, I mean, you did say that you didn't get an awful lot on human trafficking, but you did get a lot more on smuggling. I mean, is there any reason for this? I mean, what's your take on it? Because you see it probably more than most of us.
Yeah, sure. Hopefully I'm coming across nice and clear, but the hotline has been extremely successful, and probably because it's key independence, and so we get reports from athletes, heads of administration, law enforcement, and government employees making reports where they feel that they have the have to report that through the official channels that they have existing. So we provide that independent capability on that. And what we're seeing from, I say, the smuggling side is aspects. This leads back to even the days of smuggling by football players in the Mexican market, moving drugs and cash through by cartels and through football organisations. And that's been going on for decades. But we're seeing that sort of now through and some of the investigations we're conducting now, where we're seeing sports people being involved in high-level crimes, high-level trafficking of illicit substances and so forth. So we don't know whether that at this stage is either forced or party to those offences, but that's where we're sort of seeing a lot more of athletes being involved with organised crime syndicates in high-level crime. So we're using that information to then pass on to law enforcement and government authorities at the moment. So hopefully we'll see some interesting traction this year.
Okay. We are pretty much at the end of our time. I've just got a question here. Innie, can you repeat the source of the 15,000 figure again for someone who's texted in?
So it's called Culture Food Solidaire, CFS. They're an accredited charity in France who do research on this problem.
All right, so a couple of the questions that have been sent in that we're not going to ask because we haven't got the time. One was from Charles Strickland, who is a freelance. He asked, what is the prevalence of human trafficking in sport, and what lessons are learned that have been successful in minimising harm, risk in women and girls? I think to a large degree that is one of the we haven't really separated out that from the boys to lottery, but I think Giovanni touched on it quite effectively when he talked about what was happening within two high-profile cases within FIFA. The other question is, what can be done in cases where suspicions of trafficking are ignored by a national governing body and the world governing body is far removed from the reporting party? That's from Jonathan Booker, who's the sporting director of Chiron Sports and Media. I mean, that actually is the crux of a lot of the problems, isn't it? So if you don't follow the rules, as Giovanni said, there's not an awful lot we can do, but you have to follow the rules because that's what integrity is all about. And obviously the convention 182 gives you the rule and the rubric to follow. I have to really wrap it up here. I want to say thank you to everybody. We could go on for hours and hours and hours, and the topic deserves more than that because it is so important. Big thank you to everybody. Big thank you to Siga.
Thank you
for putting this on. I would encourage all of you to talk to each other. Please keep talking to me because there are so many issues with them that we do need to bring them to a wider platform. Thank you again very much. Stay safe and have a great weekend.